Welcome to a lecture about The Adventure of the Speckled Band, a Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes short story. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's short story, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, is one of the 56 Sherlock Holmes mystery tales. This one begins in the London environs, particularly in his office at 221B Baker Street. As always, the tale is told via the narration of Dr. Watson, Holmes' assistant. This first person view from a narrator who is not the main character allows the reader to feel an intimacy with the characters and situations without revealing the mind and thereby spoiling the mystery endings of Holmes. The genre of mystery is one of the most popular genres and has grown to include a range of categories which include cozy, had I but known, hard-boiled, police procedural, suspense, noir, paranormal, and the genius detective, to name most of them. Sherlock Holmes is a household name with hundreds of novels, television series, and films patterned after a nearly all-knowing and usually quirky detective character. The Speckled Band is quintessential Holmes, a mysterious death, the threat of more death, a varied cast, and even a Gothic-style setting. Think Scooby-Doo, the farcical version of exactly this sort of Sherlock Holmes mystery. As with most of Holmes' mysteries, Watson is writing about cases in the past that he covered with Sherlock Holmes between 1882 and 1893. Then he settles on recounting this one from 1883. Mind you, the first Sherlock story was set in 1882 and continued through 1893, just as Watson's rememberings do. However, Doyle was actually writing stories about Sherlock from 1887 to 1927. This mystery revolves around a family called the Roylotts and their estate, which has fallen somewhat into disrepair. The estate is called Stoke Moran, and it's in Surrey, England. It has been 8 years since the events in this story happened, and Watson mentions that since the lady involved has died, the case, which had been kept private, could be openly discussed. The plot has a really complex backstory, which revolves around a lady in her 30s named Helen Stoner, who lives with her stepfather, a Dr. Roylott. Her father, Major General Stoner, had died when she and her twin sister Julia were only 2 years old, and her mother had married Dr. Roylott not long after, who, at the time, had a thriving medical practice where they all lived in that time period in Calcutta, India. Unfortunately, Dr. Roylott accused a man of thievery and killed him in a blind rage. Because of the scandal, the family moved back to his inherited and impoverished estate, Stoke Moran, in Surrey, England. Shortly afterwards, the new Mrs. Roylott died in a railroad accident. Unfortunately, as the girls grew up, Dr. Roylott became more and more erratic and violent. He gave up work since he had inherited a large sum of money from Helen's mother. But he was so prone to fits of temper and to keeping dangerous wild animals that he imported, like cheetahs and baboons, that no one would work for him or come on his property. He started so many brawls in town that the villagers avoided him. So the girls grew up alone, taking care of each other and the property as best they could. When they were 30, Julia met a man through a distant cousin and became engaged. Their mother had provided for them in that a portion of the money Dr. Roylott had inherited from her was to legally go to Julia and Helen upon marriage. Several days before the wedding, Julia, whose room was between Dr. Roylott's room and Helen's room, because they only use one wing of the castle, or the estate, she began complaining that she would be awakened by whistling and a grating sound, even though she kept her room and windows locked and secure. One night, Helen was awakened by screams, and upon rushing to her sister's room, she caught her as she emerged from her room and passed out. All Julia could utter was the words, "It was the Speckled Band." Julia died without regaining consciousness, and the coroner could not find any way into her room nor any evidence of violence or poison on her person. It's been a couple of years, and Helen has become engaged. Her stepfather, Dr. Roy Lott, also began some renovations, theoretically, that meant that Helen had to move to her dead sister's room. Now she hears a whistle and a grating sound at night, in addition to the nightmare of sleeping in the bed where her sister had died and the continued abuse, because he's not a good guy, of her stepfather. Holmes agrees to join her at Stoke Moran, without her stepfather's knowledge, of course. No sooner had Helen left, however, than the devil himself, Grimsby Roylott, bursts uninvited into 221B Baker Street and physically threatens Holmes to stay the heck away from him and his stepdaughter, and he demonstrates his strength by bending a fire poker. This tale is a little different than the average detective mystery because the reader knows right away that the guilty party has to be Dr. Roylott. He has the motive and a murderous temperament. Plus, there's the threat of wild animals running free on the estate and a band of gypsies, the only people Dr. Roylott seems to like, camping on the property. Yes, as in other tales from the time period, like Dracula, the gypsy culture is maligned. For the sake of continuing this tale, we're just going to kind of bypass that here. This story also represents the whole locked room scenario, which is repeated in almost every mystery series since in one episode. How did the murderer enter and exit? How was the killing done? In this case, Holmes is one step ahead of things as usual. He and Watson sneak into the manor, with Helen's help, of course, and they stay in Helen's room. Spoiler alert time. After a suspenseful evening and much deduction on Holmes' part, Holmes uncovers the fact that Dr. Roylott has trained a swamp adder, commonly called a speckled band, to crawl through a vent from his room into the next room, climb down the bell rope and onto the bed, then return to Dr. Roylott for a bowl of milk at the sound of a whistle. It isn't efficient and not even possible for a snake to climb a rope or come to a whistle, but in this case it is. And eventually, Julia had rolled over onto the snake and been bitten, as Helen would have also done eventually. The icing on the cake is that when the snake began to slither from the vent, Holmes hit it with his cane, and it had returned really angry to its master, Dr. Roylott, biting him and killing him. So, what is the deal with this story? The Adventure of the Speckled Band is a classic locked room mystery that deals with the classist themes of greed, inheritance, and freedom, which is a common early modern trope. The tone is perfectly Doyle as Sherlock, and this means the mood is dark and mysterious. The conflicts include person versus society, person and nature. Symbols abound, but particularly revolve around the snake, which represents Dr. Roylott himself, and to some degree a greedy and superficial aristocracy. Grimsby seems to like everything that is wild and dangerous because he considers himself to be. The rambling manor, the snake, the baboon, the cheetah, and yes, apolitically, the gypsies. The tale is also filled with Gothic elements in the form of Stoke Moran and the violent and despotic nature of the Roylott family, which squandered its money and produced temperamental heirs. This story is considered by some critics to be Doyle's finest work, and the author himself called it his best story. I wouldn't go that far, but it is a splendid representative of the time and the genre. This has been a production of Kendrick Curriculum brought to you by Lisa M. Kendrick. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thanks so much for listening.